I've told, oh, I've told Chris and others many times that I wish we had an organization like this when I was doing my PhD. I think it just seems like a good thing to have in any sort of environment. So Chris already did an excellent job introducing myself, so this slide was completely unnecessary. But I just wanted to talk a bit about the area of study, the field that I'm in. So I'm an organizational psychologist, and this may be your first time hearing about such a term. But what I essentially do is I study human behavior or human psychology in the workplace. So the workplace is like a domain that nearly everyone will take part in their adult life, and it's seen as like a microcosm of society. So understanding the different ways we think, act, feel, behave in the workplace, I think is quite an important endeavor. And as Chris said, my main research question seeks to answer why people do bad things at work. So I'm interested in all the evil stuff in organizations, to put it casually. I'm interested in workplace bullying, bystanders, and other sort of unethical behaviors like counterproductive work behavior, so theft, lying, slacking off work, things like that. But another stream of research that I have is I'm interested in evaluating kind of interventions in the workplace, or training programs you would get, making sure that they're scientifically developed and evaluated. And I'm interested in well-being at work generally. So today, I just want to highlight the aims really quickly and offer a bit of a confession. So as the title says, I'm going to be talking about adult bullying, which is not really a term you hear often, but the types of behaviors are things that we unfortunately come across in daily life, either by reading things in the news or unfortunately maybe experiencing them ourselves. Adult bullying or adult destructive interpersonal relationships can take many forms. So you have like sexual harassment, domestic violence, street violence, which are their own kind of very rich areas of research. But I will be focusing on the work domain, specifically workplace bullying and bullying within academia. The kind of academic world isn't exactly my main context of study, but I acknowledge that PhDs exist in a strange in-between land, where you are a student, but you are considered in many instances an employee and have the dynamics of an employee. So it's important to acknowledge that. And what I want to do is, after I give some information about what workplace bullying is, I want to talk about what can be done and what's available in many workplaces. Unfortunately, I come from a UK context, so I'm aware of the things that are available in Great Britain, England specifically. I've tried to do some research on Swiss, specifically Zurich context, so hopefully that will help you a bit. Okay. So I'll just start off by talking a bit about workplace bullying. So this may be a term that you have come across in reading the news or in sort of awareness campaigns. So I picked up these headlines recently from the English news, and unfortunately you can see that workplace bullying is a huge issue with often fatal consequences. And the era of working from home doesn't necessarily mean that workplace bullying is over. So just because you're not co-located in the same university doesn't mean that you're safe from bullying. So I wanted to hear first what people's understanding of the term workplace bullying is. And what I would do here is give a Menti link, but I think because there's not so many people right now, we could maybe spend 2 or 3 minutes, 2 minutes or something, sharing either in the chat, or if you want to unmute your microphone, what type of behaviors you think count as workplace bullying. What type of behaviors might that manifest in? So if you're comfortable to share either in the chat, I'm happy to read it out, or by unmuting, I'd be very grateful. I see Emily's put in the chat. I think in multiple workings, the mindset is that the elder people often feel the younger have to earn or pay their dues, and that there's politics. Definitely agree, Emily. I've heard lots of stories about how people feel that because they went through bullying as kind of maybe an initiation ritual or something that they had to endure when they were first starting out, they feel that other people have to go through it. I remember one of my friends who was doing medical rounds telling me, they warn us that the surgeons may throw things at us when we're doing our surgical rounds, because that was what they had to deal with when they were younger. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's okay. Cynthia said, at our college, at our lab, there's a lot of passive aggressive communication. So maybe not outwardly aggressive or harmful behaviors, but things that are very subjective. So you feel like maybe you're taking it the wrong way, there's something wrong with you, and you're very sensitive, but it does still hurt you nevertheless. Anything else? If anyone wants to raise their hand or speak up. I think people in a trench coat, bosses mistreating employees. Yes, so kind of the role that the leaders play can really have a big sort of effect on the culture. And they've also said, I'm experiencing classmates in uni who've started stalking online and in person over schools or personal issues. Yes, so there's always a spillover nowadays between virtual cyberbullying or cyber stalking and traditional bullying. Not being included in activities outside of work that are constantly talked about at work. Yes, so feeling socially excluded is something that is very often part of workplace bullying. I read a very interesting study several years ago that got me into this topic, talking about how ostracism, so social exclusion, actually activates the part of the brain that is associated with physical pain. So it really is a painful, unpleasant experience. Having master supervisors who've treated students badly and newer professors as well. Yes, so it does happen very often in an academic context. So I will be talking about workplace bullying generally and then narrowing it down to the university higher education context later. So unless anyone has anything else to add, maybe in the chat or via microphone, I'm happy to move on. Yeah, passive behavior from colleagues not interacting with you, definitely. So having people exclude you, again, very painful experience. Maybe it's interesting how passive aggressive came up twice in the chat. We talked about how highly subjective these behaviors are, highly context specific. Younger students are also volunteer for, yes. Yeah, so younger students or people who don't exactly have the power may be given more work than is considered fair because they don't necessarily have the power to say no. Yes, and workplace gossip as well. That's one area I'm really interested in going into. So thank you very much for that. I hope we'll have more engagement later on. But I'm going to go into my lecture mode right now and talk and move on with the slide. So thank you. So workplace bullying is, maybe it's your first time hearing the term itself, but it's known by very many names. There's workplace violence, harassment, undermining. I believe in German it's called mobbing. So in Northern Europe, Scandinavian, Germany, it's called mobbing. In French, it's called I'm not going to try my French. It'll be too embarrassing to the Swiss, but it's called moral harassment. But what is it exactly? So we're going to go off an academic definition of workplace bullying, because our kind of intuitive definitions may be quite subjective. So the most widely accepted definition of workplace bullying is the act of harassing, offending, socially excluding someone, or negatively affecting their work. It has to occur repeatedly and regularly and over a long period of time. Bullying is an escalating process in the course of which the person confronted ends up in an inferior position and becomes the target of systematic negative acts. So it's quite a long definition, but I've highlighted in blue some of the key features that separate workplace bullying from maybe other unpleasant interactions at work. And these key features are repetition, long duration, escalation of bullying, and a power imbalance. So I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. So for workplace bullying to be considered workplace bullying, academics and practitioners often say that it must occur regularly and over a long period of time, which differentiates it from one-off exchanges. So if someone's very stressed and they maybe lash out at you, that is obviously difficult and unpleasant to experience, but the isolated nature of that incident means that it's not bullying. So the academic criteria for events to be labeled bullying is that behaviors have to occur at least once a week over a period of 6 months. So that's kind of the general criteria, but we know that because bullying is so subjective, it's important not to stick very, very strongly to this criteria when you're dealing with real life cases. What I mean by that is if someone's being bullied for 5 months and they come up to you, for example, in your role as a manager, you can't really say, well, come back in a month and then we'll talk about it. You know, it's important to have some flexibility. However, many academic reviews suggest that bullying does go on for much longer than the 6 months. So 6 months might actually be quite an early cutoff. In a recent European review, they found that the average duration is about 32 months, so almost 3 years. Workplace bullying is also known for its power imbalance and escalation. So I'll talk a bit more about power imbalance later, but perpetrators are often in positions where they're more powerful than the targets. So as we said in the chat, either supervisors, bosses, managers, or maybe someone who has more social power than the target. Or in cases where bullying is between colleagues, someone ultimately ends up becoming more powerful in the relationship. So they become the one who is the bully. And the bullying behaviors can be described in what we call a vicious circle, when the negative acts escalate to the point that targets feel further isolated as behaviors worsen, and other people, so people outside the bully target relationship, become involved. So I wanted to take a step back and talk about the wider picture of workplace bullying. So there are what we call methodological variations of prevalence rates. So depending on the type of method you use to measure bullying, the prevalence rate changes. So in some cases, if you have anonymous surveys, they might be higher. The type of questions you ask might change the prevalence. But the average is between around 10 to 20% in representative samples. So 10 to 20% of people identify as being bullied at that moment. And we're unsure, given the methodological variance, whether this rate is increasing or decreasing over time. So we have no idea if we're improving or worsening as a society. Recent reports have kind of stuck to this average. So a 2019 UK report found that 15% of employees have experienced bullying, while a report in the US last year found that 30% have suffered abusive conduct at work, and that if you are working remotely, so working from home, you're more likely to experience that type of abuse. In regards to witnessing bullying, because bullying doesn't occur in a vacuum and organizations are social domains, the rates are very much more. So depending on the study, the culture, the organization, you could have anywhere between 18 to 83% of people witnessing bullying in the past 6 months. So what about the sources of bullying? So where do the bullies come from, or where do they sit in the hierarchy of the workplace? So a recent study by Dieter Zapf, I think at Frankfurt University, found that a large majority, so 50% of bullies are supervisors. And we're going to be talking about the role of supervisors, particularly academic supervisors, later on. But it makes sense that supervisors who hold greater formal power over a target job, career progression, and daily work experiences have more power to engage in bullying behaviors. But we also know that a very close percentage of colleagues also engage in bullying. So people who are in your work team or people that you interact with every day. A smaller slice of perpetrators are subordinates, so people who work under you. And that makes sense because if you are working, you don't necessarily have the formal powers to engage in bullying. But what researchers have found is that subordinates tend to bully bosses in cases where the bosses are perhaps younger than their employees, or if it's a group of men bullying a female boss or a female manager. So there's that social or informal power that's in place. So there are two main types of bullying that I've hinted at later on, and maybe this will help you identify the different types of negative behaviors that you may come across in daily life. So the most common type of bullying is what we call predatory bullying. So it's a bit like, as in the clip art, like the wolf looking at the sheep. And this is normally when the bully is in a position of power and the target hasn't really done anything provocative. So the bully just uses their power and engages in these negative acts in a way to demonstrate their status or to maintain their powerful position. And it's something that can be institutionalized. So this can be something that can be normalized within a workplace where it's normal for managers to bully new incoming staff to set a power dynamic or to let people know, I guess, like the pecking order of a workplace. I was speaking to someone who was working in one of the big four, big five accountancy firms. I won't say which one. And they said that, you have all these new graduate intakes and you would have the bosses like bullying the second year intake in front of the first year intake in order to kind of set the tone and to show, this is what's going to happen to you. I'm the boss. And it's very, very normalized there. This was several years ago, and I hope it's changed, but it really shows how it can be seen as part of like initiation in a workplace, as discussed in the earlier chat. On the other end, we have what we call dispute-related bullying. So this normally occurs between people who are in relatively the same position at work, so one is not the manager or more powerful than the other. And because they usually start off on equal footing, bullying tends to develop out of work grievances. So maybe disagreements over like a work project, how things are done, something that can be seen as just task or project conflict. Which is very normal. People disagree about how to do tasks all the time, and it can be quite productive in an organization. The danger is when these task-related conflicts escalate and become personal and develops into personal conflict, where it's not, I disagree with you over this task, it's I disagree with you as a person. And because the parties start out quite equal, there's usually like a fight for dominance in these conflict situations, and one person ends up gaining the upper hand and becoming the bully. So hopefully I've been a relatively good overview of how bullying manifests in the workplace and some of its key features. I wanted to talk a bit more generally about the consequences of workplace bullying on the individual. And as one can imagine, workplace bullying can have severely detrimental effects on one's mental health. So there's so many studies that strongly link experiencing bullying, especially if it's regular and persistent, associating bullying with depression, higher levels of depression, higher levels of stress, mood swings, irritability, self-esteem issues, and higher levels of anxiety, which obviously can affect the way you behave at work and can affect your health. And the way mental health can feed into this vicious circle of bullying is if a target becomes very, very stressed, anxious at work, more likely to withdraw and to maybe start making mistakes, making errors at work. And people might start noticing that this employee is acting different, they're negatively affecting everyone's work, and people may actually start ganging up on the target because of these changed, withdrawn behaviors, which further isolates them. So that's what we mean by the vicious circle, that it just gets worse and worse, and the target as time and the bullying goes on. In extreme cases, bullying can lead to self-harm, symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation, or even, unfortunately, suicide. So I know in Norway and in some other countries, there are actual clinics where past victims of workplace bullying can go to like heal and to get proper targeted therapy. And people are likely to get flashbacks, get triggered by certain events, and are reminded of their awful bullying experiences. So it can really affect one's quality of life. If you talk to people who maybe don't buy the idea of bullying, they think bullying is just confined to the classroom for children. And they say, if you're strong enough, if you're resilient enough, you're going to be fine. Like, it doesn't matter if you're being bullied or not. There's research that disputes this assumption. So they found that at low levels of bullying, so if you're experiencing maybe very occasional, mild negative behaviors, yes, being resilient does protect you from some of the negative effects, but no matter how resilient you are, if you're experiencing high levels of bullying, you're going to be worn down over time, and that you can't place the responsibility of protecting an employee from bullying solely on the employees themselves. So I kind of just wanted to stop there very quickly. Does this make sense to everyone? I'm just going to see if there are any. I can only see Chris. So does everything seem okay quickly? Yeah, okay, good. So as I've said before, there's the adverse mental health effect can lead to detrimental physical health effects. So there are several studies linking workplace bullying to worse cardiovascular health, gastrointestinal issues, and decreased quality of life, which then leads to behavioral changes. There was a study several years ago in Finland that found that targets of workplace bullying were more likely to be dependent on sleep-inducing drugs and sedatives compared to non-bully populations. And that obviously is a public health issue. So I'm going to move right here. So I'm going to move on from general workplace bullying and talk about bullying within an academic context. And I know a lot of you are students right now, and I work in a university, so I'm very, very familiar with some of the issues presented here. So this is the cover of a recent article in Nature magazine. I think it came out in 2018, 2019, asking whether science or academia has a bullying problem, because there have been several cases of bullying that have leaked into the press or become widely known outside of it. So I kind of wanted to ask, we could talk in the chat about this, or we can talk to, you can unmute your mic. I wanted to ask, how may workplace bullying in academia differ from general workplace bullying? So how might universities be a unique context? So what are some of the behaviors that may be unique? See if anyone in the chat has anything to say. Yeah, Kari says sabotaging research, undermining. So because research is such an integral part of academic life, especially if you're in the PhD, postdoc, early career stage, it's often the target of people's negative behaviors. There's a power struggle that's even greater in academia. Yes, academia, especially in some countries, has very strong hierarchies, which can be very detrimental when you have people who may abuse being in higher positions of power. Yeah, there's stealing of ideas. Yet we'll talk quickly about that. Manuscript authorship details. Ferris says in academia, it always feels like you depend so much more on your future, your future parental pressure. Everything closes it on you hard and can ruin your results and performance. Yep. So it just feels like everything, this one position that you have feels like it may determine your future career prospects. And of course, having family pressure can definitely affect that. And I feel like we're more dependent on our work study place. We can't just look for a new job. Yes, I definitely agree. I mean, everyone, I'm sure it's the same perhaps in Switzerland. Academic jobs are so hard to come by, and people don't necessarily want to move to the other side of the country or to a new country to find a job. So it feels like your chance for quote unquote escape or improving your prospects may be a lot lower or a lot more difficult than someone in a regular organization who have more chances available locally. So maybe leaving an organization means you have to upend your life, which is also very stressful and is its own bag of, kettle of fish. Yeah, so thank you for that. There's nothing else. I think I'm going to move on, but thank you for sharing your thoughts. At the wider picture of academic workplace bullying. So we talked a bit about the prevalence of regular bullying. And as in general workplace bullying, the prevalence of academic bullying varies depending on the sample, the culture, the methods used. But from what researchers have found, bullying rates in academia appear higher than in the general population. So if you think back to my slide, researchers estimated an average about 10 to 20% in the general population. In academia, it's about 18 to 68%, which is so much higher than the general population. And the rates for witnessing bullying, they're about the same, but still staggeringly high, which begs the question of what is going on in academia. Is it about the people is there something about the context or the structure of academia that makes you more likely to experience bullying? Is it maybe the type of people you are asking, the way they're responding to questions? It's a very fascinating area to explore, and there's not a lot of research on it, at least within organizational psychology. In education studies, it's another picture, but this is something, doing this research, doing the preparation for this presentation made me just very interested in this topic. As one can imagine, research suggests that you're more likely to be bullied if you're a junior scholar. So if you're just starting out in your academic career as an assistant professor or a lecturer, or a PhD student or a postdoc, you're more likely to be bullied because you're not in a strong position of power. And targets tend to be on precarious contracts. So they tend to be like untenured or on short-term contract. They don't necessarily have the strong employment rights or awareness of employment rights that permanent, more senior employees have. And this shows, the effects of all this shows in dropout rates and other sort of metrics. So in the US, 40 to 70% of PhD students leave their degrees prematurely. So they don't finish their PhDs, and they often drop out within the first year or two. And I can say within the UK, we have just based on my own kind of anecdotal experience, I think the rates are quite similar. It's a very, very high dropout. And I think a lot of it does have to do with the relationship between one's supervisor, one's lab, and that how that affects your experiences at work. So as I've said before, there's generally an inherent power imbalance that exists in academia and is very strong in supervisor-student relationships, which may facilitate bullying. So you might have more of that predatory style bullying that I talked about in earlier slides. And for example, a lab or a division or a department may have an institutionalized culture of bullying, which normalizes these awful behaviors. And the power imbalance means that supervisors are often in positions to exploit their students or their postdocs. So we talked about that a bit in the chat. So exploitation are behaviors that are obviously quite negative, and they serve like a selfish gain for the bullies. So that could be like, changing authorship in a paper or stealing data or undermining data. Whereas abuse doesn't really have like a selfish gain in the end, but it is still punishing. So it just tends to be negative behaviors for the sake of negative behavior. And I've speculated a bit on this, but I think that academia is like it's a very unique job context, and there are certain factors or facets within the job environment that may be conducive to bullying, that may encourage bullying behaviors. So there's a high level of autonomy in academia. So, you're often your own person who, you do your own research. You're not very strongly managed if you're in a professorial position. You have your own lab or your own research group, and you're in charge of that. And as a senior professor or principal investigator, you may not exactly use that type of power or autonomy in a positive way. As we've said before, there's a quite strong hierarchy in many countries and in many cultures, which exacerbates kind of power imbalances. And cultures as well, there's a high level of job precarity, which means that people are often in unstable jobs and they feel like they don't have the security to fight back if they are being negatively targeted. And there are bullying behaviors that are more common within academic context, but are less common in non-academic context. So we talked a bit about this in the chat. You could have these exploitative behaviors such as bullies violating one's intellectual property, unfair crediting, reputation damage. So because academia tends to be quite small, the field or the niche of the field that you're in is really could just be a few dozen people. Negative workplace gossip can really damage one's reputation and affect one's future job prospects. The kind of strong, like a very famous or high up professor has the ability to kind of just damage one's reputation within a small circle. And there may be pressures from bullies to breach ethical codes, so to falsify data or to engage in undesirable or prohibited research practices. And this obviously leads to situations where PhD students feel powerless because they often rely on their supervisors for networks, for references, and for future job prospects, which means that they often feel like they can't escape from their abusive or bullying situations. And it doesn't help that all of the time PhD students and postdocs don't have clear employment rights. And this is especially more acute for international students who may be relying on their lab or their university for visas to stay in the country. And feeling like if you quit your job, you have to upend your life again is obviously very traumatic and will put people off from maybe pursuing us for their bullying experiences. So unsurprisingly, there's a huge issue with underreporting in academia. They found that, a relatively recent study found that 2/3 employees don't report their incidents that they experience because they just feel like they're too reliant on their bullies, their supervisors for their future career. And that because universities tend to be quite bureaucratic, the reporting processes are not very well understood or are so complicated that people feel like nothing serious can be done, at least in a realistic period of time. So, as one can understand, the effects of academic bullying are quite similar to those in regular bullying: poor mental health, poor physical health, and behavioral changes. But you have to look at the interaction of that. PhD students tend to be more stressed than the general population. So having this added stressor, this added negative thing, may create a cumulative effect where people feel even worse than they may do if they experience it in quote unquote the real world. Research has also found that students who do experience abusive supervision or bullying are less motivated and they're less creative in their work, which makes sense. If you're being bothered by bullying constantly, you're not going to feel like you can perform as well or maybe generate novel, innovative ideas, which can then affect your output, which affects your ability to get a job later on. In the wider context, this has an effect on students, so teaching quality. It affects relationships with colleagues and one's own overall university culture. And in the worst case scenario, bullying behaviors may be normalized within the target, who then model their own actions off their abusive supervisor or colleague and carry on these behaviors when they themselves are senior academics. So the cycle just continues on. So I'm just going to skip this question because I know we're a little bit short on time, but I'm going to talk very quickly about addressing bullying and what you can do if you are feeling bullied. It's a very difficult problem to address, and many organizations struggle to properly address bullying, or they like to shove it under the rug and say, nothing, nothing is wrong, everything is fine. And oftentimes the resources that are available to employees are things that they don't really think are that useful. So employees want to be able to speak with someone either in a position of authority or not. They want to be able to speak with someone in confidence and just kind of share their experiences and get advice, and in the knowledge that sharing won't affect their career. So a study found this is what employees in universities value the most. However, the most common resources available, like trade unions, human resource managers, and conflict mediation, are seen quite negatively. They feel like employees feel like nothing can really be done out of participating or contacting these bodies. Within a UK context, there's legislation in place for bullying and harassment, more harassment than bullying, but there is government advice on what to do if you are experiencing negative behaviors, because legally employers have a duty of care to their workers, and employers are encouraged to take preventative measures to stop bullying from happening rather than curing secondary measures. Of course, this is all ideal, and there is a lot of bullying in many organizations in the UK, but it's important to know that there are legal frameworks in many countries to offer guidance. Practical steps, it's very difficult to offer practical steps, especially because things vary in different countries, different regions, and different cultures. But it's important to look at what confidential services are available at your workplace or your university. So it's oftentimes people may think that the only thing they can do is go straight to their manager to discuss bullying situations. It's very difficult to do that, especially if your manager is the one who may be facilitating or starting the mistreatment. So I know in ETH Zurich, I think maybe partially because of a relatively recent bullying case, there's a stronger arsenal of resources available. I couldn't really find something for the University of Zurich, but but I know they have counseling services there. I've also put like the names of, I think, Zurich-based workplace bullying organizations that are, so these third-party organizations often have the resources and legal and psychological expertise to help people who are going through difficult times. Within one's organization, there may be like confidential mental health trained people that you can talk to with it more informally. So you have well-being champions in my university. And when I gave a talk to the European Union a while ago, and they have what they call confidential counselors. So regular employees or colleagues who are trained to offer, to be this confidential ear that one can listen to and can signpost targets to next steps. And what should you do if you see someone being bullied? It's important to try and support the person if you feel like it's appropriate. It may mean more to them than you think. There are sometimes systems in place in universities or organizations where you can report incidents that you witnessed, so you don't necessarily have to experience it yourself. You can just report that you were concerned, and hopefully in an ideal world, universities or organizations will follow up and investigate. I say that it's important to try and support the target or to try and stop the supervisor if you can, because group norms are so important in influencing how bullying progresses. So I've done quite a bit of research that I've published on this, and just group behaviors, the behaviors of bystanders can really mitigate the negative effects of bullying, and can even create environments where bullying just doesn't happen in the first place. So I realize I kind of whizzed through that last because I didn't want to take up too much time, but I wanted to end on this quote that I found in that Nature article that I've linked below, and about bullying in academia. And the quote reads, we will never know how many promising scientific careers around the world have been brought to a premature end because young researchers felt they could not continue to work under a bullying senior figure. Obviously, this goes beyond scientific careers. You can talk about universities as a whole, workplaces as a whole. You don't know what is being done, what potential you're missing out on because of these sometimes preventable negative workplaces. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope you've learned something from this, or have found things to think about. I'm just looking at the chat right now, so I hope it's good things. And yes, so I'm ready to take any questions, and I will stop sharing so that I can see everyone. Thank you very much. So are there any questions? I'm not sure if I'm moderating, if I'm